You find yourself standing witness to a grim spectacle, the chilling sound of metal clinking against a stone echoing in the distance. The act of castration looms before you, not just a physical mutilation, but a harrowing ritual steeped in cruelty and power. This is a moment where humanity's darkest desires collide with the fragility of identity, where the line between dominance and destruction blurs in the most grotesque fashion. Before diving into these 7 brutal methods of castration that history is obscured, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths of our past, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. It's incredible how we connect through these dark tales, transcending time and space in our shared curiosity about what once was. The screaming didn't always end with death. Sometimes it lingered raw, ragged, a dreadful echo in the hollow chambers of history. The act itself was a surgical obliteration, a severing, not just of flesh, but of identity. Castration, a word that carries the weight of cruelty control and annihilation. It was among the darkest scars mankind has inflicted upon itself for centuries. Castration was not merely a punishment. It was a deliberate tool of domination. To remove a man's power was to remove the very essence of his being, to reduce him to a shadow in the eyes of his society. This brutal act was wielded like a weapon, one sharpened by fear, politics, and twisted notions of purity. The body was shattered, but so too was the soul, crushed beneath the weight of imposed impotence and societal exile. In many ancient civilizations, castration was a form of social engineering. It was about control over populations, over lineage, over the chaos of raw masculinity that threatened established orders. To castrate a man was to silence his future, to erase his bloodline, to bind him to servitude or exile. The echoes of this violence were not confined to physical pain alone. They rippled through communities, fracturing families and rewriting histories. The victims were countless slaves, prisoners of war, traitors, and even sons deemed unworthy. Their bodies became battlegrounds for power struggles far larger than themselves. The act was as symbolic as it was physical, a mutilation that spoke louder than words. It was a message carved in flesh, obedience or oblivion. Yet the horror of castration was compounded by its permanence. Unlike wounds that heal, the void left by the removal of genitalia was absolute. The screaming weather of agony, despair, or rage was an opening note to a life irrevocably transformed. Survivors bore the mark of their mutilation in more than scars. Their social identities were rewritten, their voices diminished, their places in the world forever altered. The cruelty of castration lay not only in the act itself but in the aftermath. Those who survived the surgical blade often faced rejection, isolation, and a grotesque form of othering. Their bodies became sites of shame and fascination. Their altered forms a reminder of the power wielded over them. In some cultures, they were elevated to positions of trust and influence eunuchs who served emperors and sultans. Yet even then, that humanity was filtered through the prism of their mutilation. The pain was indescribable. A searing wave that surged through the entire body. It was pain without relief, without redemption. The risk of infection and death loomed large, a constant companion to the act itself. Blood flowed freely, screams tore through the air. Yet the process was often carried out swiftly. A merciless efficiency born of necessity and cruelty. To understand castration is to confront the darkest impulses of human history. It is to witness the intersection of brutality and power, where flesh becomes a battlefield and identity a casualty. It was about more than the body, it was about control. The ultimate subjugation of one human by another. The screaming has stopped, but the echoes remain. They reverberate through the annals of time. A haunting reminder of what was lost and what was taken. The act of castration in all its forms stands as a testament to the capacity for cruelty embedded deep within social and political structures. It was about domination, about stripping away not just the physical means of reproduction, but the very essence of manhood as understood by those who wielded power. Castrate was a tool to dismantle resistance, to fracture communities, to rewrite social orders with the knife as its pen. This introduction is but the first glimpse into the 7 horrors. The 7 ways in which castration has been wielded as a weapon throughout history. The following chapters will unravel the methods, each more harrowing than the last. Each a testament to the depths of human cruelty and the complex interplay of pain, power, and identity. But before the blade is raised, before the fire is stoked, Before the poison is applied, there is the understanding that castration was never merely a physical act. It was a profound psychological assault, a societal sentence that rendered the victim invisible, voiceless, and forever marked by absence. Not in the eyes of their world, not in the eyes of those who decreed their fate in the eyes of their world. They were no longer men. They were fragments broken and bound by the will of others. And so it begins the descent into 7 ways of castration. 7 methods of erasure carved into human history. The first, the most primitive and raw, demands our attention: the sharp blade. The blade was the first instrument of this cruel erasure. A simple tool yet capable of the most profound devastation. Sharp, unyielding and cold. In its final purpose, it was wielded with a grim determination that knew no mercy. The knife was the instrument of choice in countless ancient civilizations, where the precision of the cut was often secondary to the act itself. The obliteration of manhood, the process was merciless. The victim, bound tightly, was left exposed to the cold steel, the glint of which promised only pain and loss. There was no anesthesia, no comfort, only the raw edge of metal pressed against flesh, severing the delicate cords of identity and life. The sharp blade did not discriminate. It sliced through skin, muscle, and bone with brutal efficiency in the hands of those who performed this act. The blade was both a tool and weapon. It was a symbol of absolute control, a means to silence voices and sever lines of succession. The act was quick, often painfully so, but its consequences were lifelong. Survivors were marked not only by their wounds, but by the stigma that followed in ancient Mesopotamia. Castration by blade was a punishment for betrayal and treason, a statement carved into flesh that echoed through the victim's remaining days. The blade was a reminder of allegiance broken, the physical brand of disgrace. The blood that flowed was not simply the blood of the individual. It was the blood of defiance crushed beneath the weight of imperial will. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. The nerves screamed their final chorus as the blade severed connections that once defined the man's body. The agony was raw, visceral, and unrelenting. But it was the aftermath that was most harrowing. The wounds festered in the absence of modern medicine. Infection was a constant specter, waiting silently to claim the fragile life that clung to the edges of survival. The knife was not merely a tool of death, but of mutilation that left survivors physically shattered and socially discarded. The act was a violent rupture in the narrative of their existence, a rupture that echoed in the way they moved, spoke, and were perceived. The blade did not just sever flesh. It severed futures. Their voices rose higher, desperate to be heard through the haze of shock and pain. Yet in the eyes of their world, their cries were drowned by the silence imposed upon their altered bodies. The sharp blade ensured that their power was broken, their roles diminished. The social fabric that once enveloped them was rent, leaving them adrift in a sea of marginalization. In some societies, those who survived the blade's cruel incision were cast out, labeled as less than men. Their inability to reproduce was equated with the loss of worth. The stripping away of honor and status, they became shadows within their own communities, reminders of the cost of defiance or the price of servitude. Yet, paradoxically, some cultures transformed these broken men into instruments of trust and power. Eunuchs created by the blade served as guardians of harems or advisors to rulers, their mutilation rendering them both feared and indispensable. The blade was the cruel hands that both destroyed and forged new identities, identities forged in pain, but tempered by necessity. The process itself was often crude. There were no surgeons, no healing hands. Only those tasked with carrying out orders in their own hands, steady with practiced efficiency or trembling with cruel intent. The sharp blade was wielded swiftly, a merciless stroke that severed more than flesh. It severed ties to the past and hopes for the future. Survival was a precarious balance. The knife's incision could lead to death just as easily as to mutilation. The risk of infection was high, the tools unsanitary, the conditions brutal. Those who lived through the act carried the scars as a testament to both their endurance and their suffering. The screaming was loudest here in the moment. The blade bit deep and the body betrayed itself with shock and blood. It was a scream that spoke of betrayal, fear, and the ultimate loss of control. The victim's world collapsed in an instant, leaving behind a mutilated shell, a broken man. Not in the eyes of their world. The blade rendered them voiceless, powerless, and invisible. It was about more than just the immediate pain. It was about the permanent erasure of identity and agency. The knife was the first and most primitive method. Yet its brutality was unmatched in its rawness. The sharp blade represented the intersection of primal violence and calculated control. It was the physical manifestation of a society's need to punish and dominate, to take what was most essential and cast it away. The act was a ritual of destruction, a ceremony of loss, and acted with cold steel in the shadow of the blade. The victim was left to grapple with a body forever changed, a future forever altered. The physical pain gave way to psychological torment, to the slow unraveling of self that accompanies such a profound mutilation. The knife's edge cut not only through flesh, but through the very fabric of existence. The blade was a harbinger of silence. It took the power to create, to assert, and to resist. It was a tool that spoke loudly in the language of pain and domination. The language understood across cultures and centuries. The scars it left were not only on skin, but etched deeply into history. 7 ways of castration unfold from the starting point. The blade is the foundation. A cruel beginning to a series of horrors that reveal the depths of human cruelty. It is a method simple in its mechanics, the devastating in its consequences. The blade story is one of suffering and survival, of loss and the relentless assertion of power through mutilation. It is the first act in a sequence of atrocities. Each method more harrowing, more complex, more haunting than the last. The screaming didn't always end with death here at the edge of the blade. It was loudest piercing, raw and unforgettable. The screaming didn't always end with death, but sometimes it transformed, twisting into a different kind of agony. A slow-burning torment that consumed both body and mind. This was the agony wrought, mocked by the sharp blade. Alone, but by fire. Scalding, searing, merciless fire. The second method of castration was an inferno of pain. A cruel extension of punishment that prolonged suffering far beyond the swift. Cut in the dark alleys of medieval Europe and the vast empires of Asia, heat became a weapon of choice. The method was brutal in its simplicity. Molten metal, boiling water, or red-hot irons pressed against the flesh until it blistered, burned, and finally withered away. Flesh melted, nerves ignited, and the victim's body became a canvas of agony painted in blistered skin and smoking wounds. This was no instant suffering. It was a process of destruction that stretched time, turning moments into hours, hours into days. The victim writhed in silence and screams, trapped in a crucible of fire that devoured every ounce of flesh and hope. The pain was unrelenting. The ceaseless wave of torment that left scars both visible and invisible. The use of fire in castration was as much about spectacle as it was about punishment. It was designed to instill terror not just in the victim, but in all who bore witness. To watch a man's manhood consumed by flame was to see power itself reduced to ash. It was a public reminder of the price of betrayal, rebellion, or disobedience in the courts of medieval Europe. Traitors and slaves alike were subjected to this fiery mutilation. The act was a slow and torture sentence, often carried out in front of crowds to amplify its cruelty. The victim's body became a warning, a testament to the reach of authority and the futility of resistance. The physical trauma was immense. Burnt flesh, charred nerves, and the agonizing spread of infection were common companions to this method. The skin, once a protective barrier, was reduced to raw, weeping tissue. The pain was a fire that never truly died, a constant reminder of the body's betrayal. The psychological toll was equally devastating to endure. The searing heat was to confront a primal terror, to face an elemental force that consumed and destroyed. The victim's mind was trapped in a cycle of fear and pain, a loop from which escape was impossible. The ritual of burning was also layered with symbolic meaning. Fire was both purifying and destroyer, a force that cleansed through destruction. In this context, castration by fire was a perverse form of purification. A violent erasure of identity that was as much spiritual as physical. The flames stripped away more than flesh. They burned away dignity, hope, and the very essence of manhood, as defined by the societies that inflicted this torment. The victim was left a husk marked by the fire's cruel signature. A living testament to the price of power lost. Their voices rose higher. Though often only in silent screams behind clenched jaws, the agony was too intense, too consuming. For cries to escape, the fire demanded silence, submission. It was a method that crushed resistance, not only through pain, but through the sheer will to survive the unbearable, not in the eyes of their world. The victim's suffering was consumed by the spectacle, the humanity overshadowed by the flames that engulfed them. The fire was both judge and executioner, a relentless force that left no room for mercy or reprieve. This method was not random cruelty, but a calculated act of terror. It was about control, about sending a message that would sear itself into the collective memory of a people. The fire was a language of power, spoken through flesh and flame, understood by all who witnessed its wrath. The slow burn of this castration was a dance with death. Many did not survive the ordeal, succumbing to shock, blood loss, or infection. Those who did were forever changed, their bodies and spirits scarred by the inferno they endured in the aftermath. The victims were often left to fade into obscurity, their mutilated bodies, a hidden reminder of the cruelty wielded in the name of order. The fire had done its work, destroying, purifying, and silencing. The screaming has stopped, but the echoes of that fire remain small, stirring beneath the surface, a haunting reminder of the depths of human cruelty. This was not merely an act of mutilation, but a ritual of annihilation, where flesh was sacrificed to the flames of power. 7 ways of castration unfold, each revealing a darker facet of this brutal history. The second, the agonizing use of heat, stands as a fiery testament to the lengths societies have gone to control and destroy. It was about more than pain. It was about domination through spectacle, about using the most primal of elements to enforce submission. The fire was a weapon, a warning, the cruel arbiter of fate. The victims bore the scars of the flames long after the fire died. Their bodies told stories of suffering and survival of a punishment that was as merciless as it was symbolic. The flames consumed flesh, but failed to erase the memory of pain etched deep within. This was castration by fire, an inferno of agony, a slow and relentless mutilation. The next method to be revealed will take us from the flames to another form of erasure, one uniquely crafted in the halls of empire, where castration became a system, a factory of broken men. But before that, the fire lingers, a scorching reminder of what it meant to be punished by flame. The screaming didn't always end with death, but sometimes it faded into a new kind of terror, one that was wild, unpredictable, and utterly dehumanizing. This was the horror wrought not by blade or fire, but by the savage intervention of animals unleashed to rend flesh and sever identity. The fourth method of castration was a grotesque spectacle, a brutal meeting of man and beast, where power was asserted through the terror of helplessness. In rare but documented instances, animals were turned into instruments of mutilation. Dogs, known for their ferocity and loyalty, were unleashed upon prisoners or enemies with a single horrific purpose: to maim, to moor, to castrate birds of prey with their razor-sharp talons. And beaks were trained or provoked to attack the most vulnerable parts of the human body, reducing men to broken forms beneath wings and jaws. This method was as much about psychological domination as it was about physical destruction. To be torn apart by an animal was to be stripped of humanity, to descend into a primal state of fear and pain. The victim was no longer a man but prey, helpless, exposed, and utterly at the mercy of forces beyond control. The act itself was a chaos of terror. The victim's body convulsed under the savage assault. The sharp teeth and talons tearing through skin and muscle blood flowed freely. The crimson testament to the violence inflicted on the animal's growls and cries mingled with human screams, creating a symphony of horror that echoed through the places of punishment in ancient and medieval contexts. This form of castration was often reserved for the most reviled traitors, captured enemies, and those deemed unworthy of mercy. The use of animals added a layer of spectacle and humiliation, turning the act into a public display of utter degradation. The physical trauma was catastrophic. The genitals, once a source of power and identity, were reduced to mangled flesh, torn and crushed beyond repair. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a raw and primal agony inflicted not by human hands alone, but by the savage force of nature turned weapon. Survivors of such attacks were rare, and those who lived carried scars that went beyond the physical. The psychological wounds ran deep: fear, shame, and the haunting memory of helplessness. The mind grappled with the loss of control, the violation by a force that was both animal and symbol of untamed brutality. Their voices rose higher, a desperate chorus of pain and disbelief. Yet in the eyes of their world, their suffering was dismissed. Overshadowed by the spectacle and the message it conveyed, the animal's attack was a final assertion of dominance. A brutal punctuation mark on the victim's fate, not in the eyes of their world. The victim was reduced to less than human, a creature broken and cast aside. This method of castration was about more than mutilation. It was about complete dehumanization, stripping away dignity through terror and violence. The use of animals as instruments of castration was a calculated act of humiliation. It transformed the victim into prey, making them vulnerable in the most profound sense. The attack was not just physical, but symbolic. A vivid demonstration of power wielded without mercy or restraint. In some cultures, the deployment of animals in this way served as a warning to others. It was a method of social control through fear, a reminder of the consequences of defiance or betrayal. To watch a man torn apart by beasts was to confront the fragility of human dominance and the thin veneer separating civilization from savagery. The psychological aftermath was profound. The victim's sense of self was shattered alongside their body. The trauma lingered long after the wounds had healed or festered, haunting dreams and daily existence. The animal's teeth and claws left marks that no surgeon could erase. The screaming has stopped, but the echoes of that terror remain wild and haunting, a brutal reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the ways power can manifest through the most primal means. This was not merely a physical mutilation, but a ritual of fear, a ceremony of complete abasement. 7 ways of castration unfold like shadows across history, each method revealing darker and more complex layers of brutality. The fourth, the savage intervention of animals, stands as a stark testament to the extremes of dehumanization and terror. It was about control through chaos, about harnessing the wild to enforce order, about using nature's ferocity to break human spirit and body. The animals were both instrument and symbol, a raw force of destruction unleashed upon the vulnerable. Victims bore the scars of this terror, visible and invisible, physical and psychological. All the broken bodies and shattered minds told stories of a punishment that transcended pain, reaching into the very core of identity and existence. This was caste iteration by animal attack, a method where man was made prey, where power asserted itself through the most primal violence. The next chapter will lead us to another form of erasure, where chemical agents silently corroded flesh and mind. But for now, the savage echoes of the beast linger, a haunting reminder of what it meant to be utterly powerless in the face of cruelty. The screaming didn't always end with death, though sometimes it faded into a slow, corrosive silence. The kind of suffering that creeps beneath the skin, dissolving flesh and spirit alike. This was the torment wrought not by blade or fire or beast, but by chemical agents, substances designed to eat away at the body's very essence, leaving behind a husk marked by pain and decay. The fifth method of castration was a quiet horror, a creeping death that unfolds over days, weeks, or even months. Long before modern chemistry and pharmaceuticals, ancient civilizations discovered the destructive power of core sticks and poisons. Extracts from plants, minerals, and other substances were applied to the genitals, their corrosive nature slowly eating through tissue, nerves, and bone. This was a method that combined the precision of science with the cruelty of torture, a slow, deliberate unraveling of manhood. Unlike the immediate agony of the blade or the fiery torment of burning chemical castration, was insidious. It began with a sting, a burning sensation that grew into relentless pain. The flesh blistered and blackened, necrosis setting in. As the chemicals seeped deeper, the body's defenses failed and infection often followed, compounds the suffering. This method was used in various cultures, from the shadowed corners of ancient empires to the grim experiments of more recent centuries. It was a tool of control employed to silence sexual impulses and render victims powerless without the spectacle of visible mutilation. The slow progression of decay was itself a form of psychological torture. Each day, a reminder of the body's betrayal. The substances varied from caustic plant extracts like hellebore and acolyte to corrosive minerals and early poisons, applied carefully or sometimes crudely. These agents were meant to destroy not only the physical organs, but the very capacity for reproduction and desire. The victim's body became a battleground of chemical warfare, with flesh dissolving under invisible assault. The pain was unrelenting. It seeped into bones and nerves, the constant gnawing torment that allowed no rest. Survivors often became shadows of their former selves, marked by chronic pain, infection, and the stigma of their altered bodies. The slow destruction was as much a punishment of the mind as of the flesh. Their voices rose higher in silent screams, trapped behind clenched teeth, in whispered prayers, in the desperate hope for relief that never came. The chemical agents worked steadily, indifferent to cries or pleas. The body became a prison, a site of unending decay and despair, not in the eyes of their world. The victims were often invisible. The suffering hidden beneath the surface chemical castration was a quiet sentence, a punishment meted out without fanfare or public spectacle. The damage was internal, insidious, and therefore, in some ways, more absolute. This method was about control on a cellular level. It was about erasing manhood. Slowly, methodically, without the immediate drama of blood or fire. The chemicals corroded not just flesh but identity, stripping away the possibility of resistance through the gradual dismantling of the body's most intimate parts. The psychological toll was profound. To endure such slow destruction was to face a daily erosion of will and spirit. The body betrayed itself, becoming a source of pain and shame. Survivors often face social exile. Their altered bodies a secret mark of disgrace. Chemical castration also foreshadowed modern attempts to control sexuality through pharmaceuticals and hormones. A dark lineage tracing back to these early brutal practices. The intent was consistent: to dominate, to suppress, to erase the defiant masculine presence. The screaming has stopped, but the echoes of this slow chemical war linger. A haunting reminder of the many faces of cruelty. The quiet destruction wrought by sticks and poisons stands as a testament to the lengths societies have gone to control bodies and desires. 7 ways of castration unfold through history's brutal corridors. The chemical agents reveals a method that is both scientific and savage. A creeping horror that dissolves flesh and will alike. It was about more than pain, it was about silent domination. About wielding invisible weapons to enforce submission. The chemicals were merciless arbiters, stripping away power with a slow, relentless certainty. Victims bore the scars of this chemical assault, visible in the wounds that refused to heal, invisible in the torment that lingered beneath the bodies and minds. Told stories of a punishment that was as merciless as it was unseen. This was castration by chemical means, a silent, corrosive erasure of manhood. The next chapter will reveal another brutal method where crushing force obliterated flesh and identity alike. But for now, the slow decay remains a ghostly witness to the hidden depths of human cruelty. The screaming didn't always end with death, but sometimes it shattered under a crushing force, a brutal obliteration that crushed flesh and bone with merciless weight. This was castration by crushing and blunt force trauma, a method designed not merely to remove, but to annihilate. It was a violent assertion of power, a physical and symbolic destruction of masculinity reduced to rubble beneath unforgiving pressure in the shadowed arenas of punishment and spectacle. Heavy objects or mechanical devices became instruments of this cruel method. Iron hammers, weighted stones, vice-like contraptions, each chosen for their capacity to inflict maximum damage to pulverize what once symbolized manhood into unrecognizable fragments. The act was less about precision and more about overwhelming force, a raw expression of domination. Through destruction, the victim was bound or restrained, helpless beneath the looming weight of inevitability. The crushing blow descended, swift, merciless, and final flesh gave way. Bones shattered, nerves were obliterated. The pain was immediate. A searing explosion of agony that radiated through every fiber of the body. It was an obliteration of sensation. A violent erasure of identity in the most literal sense. This method was often employed as a public spectacle. A grim display meant to instill fear and to assert control. The crushing was a spectacle of destruction performed in courts, arenas or prisons where witnesses bore silent testimony to the utter ruin of the victim's body. It was punishment writ large, a brutal reminder of the consequences of defiance. The physical trauma was catastrophic. The testicles, delicate and vulnerable, were smashed beyond recognition. The surrounding tissues and structures were equally devastated. Blood gushed freely, mingling with shattered bone and torn flesh. The victim's body convulsed in reflexive agony. The final desperate protest against the destruction survival was uncertain. Many succumbed to shock or blood loss. Almost immediately, those who lived faced a lifetime marked by pain, disability, and social ostracism. The body, once a vessel of power and identity, became a site of ruin and shame. The voices rose higher, raw and desperate, piercing the air in moments before silence claimed them. The crushing method was a violent punctuation, a final act of annihilation that left no room for resistance or recovery. It was the sound of manhood shattered, of identity torn asunder by the inexorable weight of punishment. Not in the eyes of their world. The crushed were discarded, their bodies broken and their spirits bent beneath the weight of imposed impotence. This was castration as obliteration, not just of flesh, but of social standing and personal dignity. The crushing force was a metaphor for made manifest, a symbol of total subjugation. The devices used to inflict this trauma varied across cultures and eras in some contexts. Mechanical presses were designed to immobilize and destroy with cold efficiency. In others, the blunt instruments were wielded by executioners whose hands were steady with practiced cruelty. The method was raw, unrefined, yet devastatingly effective. The psychological consequences were profound. To endure such obliteration was to confront a void where identity once resided. The shattered body mirrored a shattered self, a man reduced to debris by the overwhelming force of punishment. Survivors grappled with trauma that extended far beyond the physical wounds. Crushing was also a method of spectacle, a public performance of power that enforced social hierarchies through fear. The audience bore witness to the destruction, the silence, a complicit acknowledgement of the violence required to maintain order. The crushed were reminders of the fragility of power and the brutal lengths to which it would go to preserve itself. The screaming has stopped, but the echoes of that destruction linger. A haunting testament to the violence inflicted upon bodies and identities. The crushing method stands as a stark reminder of the capacity for human cruelty expressed through sheer force. 7 ways of castration unfold each a chapter in the brutal history of bodily mutilation. The 6th, crushing and blunt force trauma, reveals a method that obliterates with overwhelming power, leaving behind ruin and silence. It was about more than pain. It was about the symbolic destruction of manhood, about reducing the most intimate parts to fragments beneath an unforgiving weight. It was a method that spoke in the language of force, a language understood across cultures and centuries. Victims bore the scars of this violence, visible in shattered remnants of flesh and bone, invisible in the wreckage that followed. Their bodies told stories of punishment meted out not with precision, but with overwhelming destructive power. This was castration by crushing a violent erasure of identity through blunt force trauma. The next chapter will lead us into the realm of ritual and religion, where castration took on new meanings woven into the fabric of faith and sacrifice. But for now, the crushing weight remains a somber reminder of the depths of human cruelty. The screaming didn't always end with death, but sometimes it transformed into a solemn, haunting silence, a silence born of faith, sacrifice, and a ritualistic surrender of flesh to higher powers. This was the 7th method of castration, ritual castration, where pain was intertwined with devotion and mutilation became a passage into sacred realms. It was a mutilation wrapped in the vestments of belief, a brutal act sanctified by the weight of religious and spiritual meaning. Across ancient Mesopotamia, India, and Rome, castration was not merely punishment or control. It was an offering, a sacrifice demanded by gods or sacred orders. The act was framed as a purification, a necessary shedding of earthly desires to transcend mortal limits. The body became a temple and the removal of manhood, a grotesque rite of passage into spiritual servitude or divine favor. The rituals varied, but the essence remained constant. The genitals were severed in ceremonies, charged with symbolism, pain, and the promise of transformation. The mutilation was both physical and metaphysical, a violent severing of the self, the crossing from profane to sacred. From man to eunuch, from mortal to servant of the divine in Mesopotamian cults, priests and devotees underwent castration as an act of devotion, surrendering their earthly masculinity to attain spiritual purity. The act was brutal, often performed with sharp blades or fire, yet enveloped in ritual chants and sacred observances. The pain was sanctified, its horror transmuted into a form of holy suffering. In ancient India, certain sects practiced ritual castration as part of ascetic traditions. The mutilation symbolized renunciation of worldly attachments, a corporeal manifestation of spiritual discipline. The act was both feared and revered, a gateway to higher states of consciousness achieved through sacrifice. Rome bore witness to ritual castration, particularly among cults devoted to gods like Saber le Matis. The self-mutilation of devotees was an expression of ecstatic devotion, a physical manifestation of spiritual transformation. The act was public, dramatic, and deeply symbolic, a violent shedding of the self in the pursuit of divine union. The physical trauma was immense. The rituals bore no mercy. The pain was searing, the wounds grievous. Yet beneath the surface of agony lay a complex interplay of belief and submission. The mutilation was not merely endured. It was embraced as a necessary sacrifice, a passage through suffering to sanctity. The voices rose higher, not in cries of despair, but in chants and hymns that elevated pain to a sacrament. The ritual framed suffering as a path to transcendence, a means of shedding the limitations imposed by flesh and desire. The mutilated body was both a victim and a vessel sacrificed to forces greater than itself, not in the eyes of their world, in sacred contexts. Castration was not a mark of disgrace but a symbol of devotion. The mutilated were transformed and their altered bodies consecrated as signs of faith and power. The act was about more than loss. It was about transformation, about rewriting identity in the language of the sacred. The psychological landscape was complex. The ritualized mutilation demanded a surrender of self that was both terrifying and empowering. Devotees relinquished their autonomy even as they gained a new spiritual identity. The pain became a bridge between the corporeal and the divine. The testament to the power of faith to redefine suffering, the social implications were equally profound. Ritual castrates often occupied unique positions within their societies. Both marginalized and revered, feared and trusted. They became intermediaries between worlds, embodiments of sacrifice and symbols of divine favor. Their mutilation was a visible marker of their spiritual status and social role. The screaming has stopped, but the echoes of ritual castration linger. A haunting fusion of pain and devotion, mutilation and meaning. It stands as a stark reminder of the complex ways human beings have intertwined cruelty with faith, suffering with transcendence. 7 ways of castration unfold like a grim tapestry through history. The 7th ritual and religious castration reveals a dimension where violence and sanctity collide, where flesh is sacrificed on the altar of belief. It was about more than pain. It was about surrender and transformation. About using mutilation as a language of devotion and power. The ritual was a paradox. A brutal act elevated to sacred sacrament. Victims bore the marks of this sacred mutilation. Wounds both physical and spiritual. The bodies told stories not only of suffering, but of faith, sacrifice, and the complex interplay between cruelty and meaning. This was castration as ritual. A haunting testament to the human capacity to entwine pain with purpose. Mutilation with transcendence. The final chapter will reflect on the broader meaning of castration itself, the deeper scars it leaves on body and soul. But for now, the sacred silence remains a somber echo of sacrifice and shattered flesh. The screaming didn't always end with death. Sometimes it faded into a haunting silence, an absence heavier than any sound. Castration, in its many brutal forms, was a mutilation of flesh and spirit, a violent severing of identity that echoed through history's darkest corridors. It was a wound far deeper than skin, a rupture that fractured the self, the body, and the soul. Throughout the ages, castration has been wielded as a tool of cruelty and control, a method to dominate, punish, and reshape society. It was about more than removing flesh. It was about erasing power, silencing voices, and rewriting destinies. 7 ways of castration. Each a unique horror have left indelible marks on human history. Yet beneath the varied methods lay a singular truth. Castration was a language of violence spoken through the body. The knife sliced through flesh with merciless precision, shattering manhood in a single, excruciating moment. The fire consumed, prolonging agony with its relentless blaze, turning skin to ash and hope to smoke. The systematic suffering within eunuch factories transformed the act into industrialized cruelty, churning out broken men as tools of empire. The savage bite of animals turned victims into prey, helpless before primal terror. Chemical agents corroded flesh and spirit alike, a slow poison that dissolved identity from within. Crushing force obliterated flesh and bone, reducing what was whole to shattered remnants. Ritual castration entwined mutilation with faith, turning pain into sacred sacrifice. A paradox of suffering and sanctity. Each method bore its own horrors, but all shared a common thread, a deliberate and profound violence against the male body and what it represented. Castration was a weapon aimed not just at flesh, but at the social order, at lineage, at the very essence of masculinity. It was about control, fear, and the assertion of power through destruction. The victims of these acts were often voiceless, their suffering hidden beneath layers of stigma, shame, or silence. Their bodies were sites of trauma and transformation marked by pain and loss. The screaming, whether loud or muted, was a testament to the brutality inflicted and the resilience endured not in the eyes of their world. In many societies, the castrated were rendered invisible, stripped of status and identity. Yet, paradoxically, some were elevated to positions of influence. Their mutilation a prerequisite for trust and power within rigid hierarchies. The act was both a punishment and the perverse form of social mobility, a complex dance of degradation and empowerment. The psychological scars ran deep. Castration was an assault on identity, a violent redefinition of self. Survivors grappled with trauma that transcended the physical, confronting loss, alienation, and the shattering of deeply held notions of manhood. The mutilated body became a symbol of vulnerable ity and exclusion, a reminder of the fragility of power and the cruelty of its wielders. The cultural implications were profound. Castration shaped histories, influenced politics, and altered social dynamics. It was a tool of empire and rebellion, of faith and fear. The act carried meanings that shifted across time and place, reflecting the complex interplay between body power and society. The screaming has stopped, but the echoes remain resonating through time as a haunting reminder of what was taken and what endured. Castration legacy is one of pain and resilience, cruelty and control, loss and transformation. To understand castration is to confront the darkest facets of human nature, to witness the ways violence can be inscribed on the body of memory. It is to acknowledge the suffering of those who bore its mark, and to reflect on the enduring power of the flesh, to tell stories of survival and sorrow. 7 ways. 7 horrors. 7 brutal methods that reveal the depths of cruelty and the complex symbolism embedded in the act of castration. It was never simply about flesh. It was about power, identity, and the human cost of domination. The screaming didn't always end with death, but the silence that followed was heavy with meaning. The silence that speaks louder than any scream ever could.